There we go. Good morning and good evening. Today, I have one many words about the dragons in D&D. Alright, let's see here. The way this is gonna go is I brought up my CSP, to which I wasn't going to, but I figured it might be a little bit neat to do some doodles while talking about them. It's definitely going to be broken up into parts due to there's actually quite a few dragons when it comes to D&D. Chromatic dragons, for one, already have a handful in them. And despite you can sit there and go through each one as is, it will take some time. Like previous stream with Opal, we did mention multiple dragons. At least in the whole case with D&D, I like talking about them due to the fact that a lot of people are afraid to use them, or even if they do, they overuse them. In reality, they can be wonderful storytelling tools, depending on if you're playing a segment already from one of the D&D handbooks, or if you're doing a whole homebrew thing. It is morning for me, so you're getting the more unhinged version. But it's alright. Firstly, though, with chromatic dragons, they are usually mostly, in almost cases, considered chaotic evil. But if you only consider them chaotic evil, that's not too fun. Sure, you have metallic dragons that are usually the good version, but there's a lot you can do. I have to find my pen. Oh, there it is. Never mind. Because the first one, mind you, there's very much differences in my art. Like I said with Opal, I figured keeping everything as stick figures is actually pretty great. Let's see. Hi, Wilson. Welcome, welcome. Yes, we're going to be covering chromatic dragons first, so I can roast them very well. Because quite honestly, they are a good tool for being villains in your stories. Sure, but a lot of cases, people may use dragons to be very few in their stories, or if they do have them, they only usually have them to be either villain number one or a replacement for a deity or patron. But I think they are much more useful than that. Even for chromatic dragons that they consider very evil. And while I draw this little goofy thing, I'm just pretty much drawing him more like I would a little lizard. So don't mind him, he's trying his best. That's very good. How are we doing, by the way, this morning or day or evening? No, that's definitely not how his jaw will be. anything, this almost reminds me of a Digimon. No, close enough. So with our chromatic dragons being mostly evil, people forget that with D&D you can pretty much do as you wish. Sure, they are fair enough tools to do as you will. But really, why just go by the handbook? There's a lot of jokes about it, that with D&D, it's only a guideline rather than an actual rule book. Looks more like a little ghosty. Alright, that will be our dragon for today. We will change his color each time depending. Okay. Let's fully go over this boy. Red dragons, they're typically in mountainous regions. So if you have some mountains in your campaign, you don't necessarily have to have them, oh, each mountain range or tall peak of sorts will have a crimson or red dragon. Quite frankly, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. There's the adults, the young dragons, vice versa. You can even have dragon hordes for them with cursed items. Even if you have the Tyranny of Dragons handbook, it does give a lot of different examples of how you could do a cursed horde. You'll pretty much have like your different set of items. And then it would be a different roll, like 1 through 10 or 11 through 20. And whenever you make those rolls, depending on your findings, depends on what you get. So necessarily, the dragon itself doesn't have to be present, as you can customize your items per dragon. So perhaps, based on time, the party never made it to the area when the dragon was there, and the dragon may temporarily be out of the way. But you do have to remember they do have their different passive abilities for if you're in their vicinity. Then that's when you can really play with your party. Though I think those only start to get more interesting when you get into gem dragons and planar dragons. Some may even say that chromatic dragons are only boring, but they only say that because they are in the basic handbook. Yes, you sit there and you have gem dragons, planar dragons being very interesting. But these ones, despite being only chaotic evil, you can have some flavor to them. Perhaps they have their only draconic form, or perhaps they also have a humanoid form. To which some, you can kind of play with that. Especially with red dragons, they are more greedy creatures. So perhaps they have a humanoid form that is tricking your party into taking all of their items. You never know. Alrighty, but we will change for him because I am on a bit of a time crunch. So we only plan to do this like an hour long. Now we have the black dragons. Sometimes they're even called skull dragons. Really depends on what platform you're playing, if you're doing homebrew or not. Or more cruel of all of them. While red dragons, they were more greedy. These ones will be the more villainous ones of it. There you can add more characteristics in there so they're not very just straightforward. They mostly you would find in swamps, and with their acid breath, you can add some interesting things in there. They don't have to end up being like a Souls game sort of villain. Quite honestly, you can also have them be just another NPC. It doesn't have to necessarily be a boss fight for the party. And it doesn't also have to be an adult dragon or elder dragon. Sometimes experimenting with having your party visit a young dragon and then meeting them again later on, it can have a little bit of an impact on your story. Perhaps they did get on the bad side for the young dragon, and then the young dragon remembers them later on, for good or for bad. Perhaps even this dragon, still evil and cruel to the rest of the world, but favors your party members from just some previous sort of interaction that they've done. There's a lot you can kind of go around it. You don't have to make your dragon NPCs very straightforward, because if you do that, it can get very, I don't want to say boring, but it can just get very, oh, we're going to point A, point B, point C, let's kill this, grab this, get the bounty, etc. Sure, you may do that for like if someone is starting out, or when I've taught people how to play D&D in the past, I like to add a little bit more flavor here and there. Because if you add things interesting from the beginning, sure, it's a little bit of a curve to learn, but then it really promotes the fact that they can sit there and do creative means to gameplay. Many even just want to go with numbers and min-maxing, but I think the more, well, personally, the more fun D&D is when you can actually get into the roleplay aspects, since it is a tabletop role-playing game. Sure, you can have characters with god powers, and you can have chromatic dragons there, being their evil boss fight. Or you can make the dragons actually have more of a personality that interacts with the party first. Especially if they get attached to the character and then have to fight them later on, then you can see their inner turmoil for having to do so. That's usually one of my tactics. One of my favorite dragons now, storm dragons or blue dragons. Because with Opal, we mentioned it last stream, Opal's one character, Cadmus, was an Air Genasi mixed with Blue Dragon. Blue Dragon being the father. And in this case is an example of, you can have a chromatic dragon, but not base him off of being chaotic evil. Instead, you can have them mix it with the party members. You can make them someone important to a character in the past. Perhaps they have a very student and teacher relationship, but later on the character finds out that they are an evil-based dragon, and a lot of their deeds were horrible and this and that. They don't necessarily have to follow the formula of, oh, it's a chromatic dragon, they have to be evil. Not necessarily. Sure, they can be, but at the same time you can make it more than just very two-dimensional, one-dimensional. Plus, blue dragons, you would only really find them in wastelands and deserts, but you still can mix that up, especially if you're running or playing in a homebrew game. There always can be reasons why they move. Most of the time, dragons will want to have a horde, but their horde, I think, can be more mobile if need be, especially when it's an adult dragon. They have different means of magic, like different pocket magic abilities, or you can even give them an item bag. They're also considered the second most roughly powerful of the chromatic dragons. That being also because they have lightning breath. Which if you have a party that is trying to min-max and be super powerful using different metal armor or having metal items on their person, one of the different area effects you could do if someone gets near them is having their metal items have a little bit of a charge to them. Because if I remember correctly, blue dragons can burrow a lot when they are in their usual form. That, and they're one of the ones that starts introducing different area effects where you can introduce hallucinations, illusions, and stuff for the characters once they start getting closer and closer to where this dragon is. A lot of that in flavor abilities you start to see later on with planar and jam, since those are a bit more of like the flavorful dragons when it comes to abilities. I will start kind of speeding up a little bit so we can get through the different dragons. Green dragons is another one I've had in D&D in my homebrew campaign. Unfortunately, the party never got to run in with them. Dragons, you can have them be very territorial, especially if they are adult dragons. The older they are, the more territory they would want to have, which, if you have multiple dragons in the story, may create some different conflicts and everything that the party have to sort of intertwine with, especially because there was a city between these two, so that added some more fighting and different issues popping up. Because these two, which was a noble dragon and the green dragon, one who is more into the fairies and could sort of planar shift and everything if they need to, you wouldn't really find a more passive dragon doing combat with a green dragon. However, green dragons, they're very territorial. So if you have a forest with a lot of different hiding spots and everything, since they're very deceptive in nature and cunning, there's a lot you can do with that, especially, again, if you have a city involved in this forest, they can even consider the city itself part of their horde. They also deal with having a poison breath, being gas and everything, so they're one of the ones that you can use with their tricky nature, especially when they start getting closer to where this dragon is. They can passively be more dangerous instead of immediately, like a blue dragon or a black dragon could be. They also pretty much loved combat, so if they could put you out of your misery from the beginning before actually face to face, they will. Okay, I'm gonna make this next one white or gray, so it's not too hard to see, but it is a white dragon. And that should show fine. They are fun. Ice dragons. Technically, they're mostly considered the weakest of dragons, especially if you have a lot of wizards or sorcerers involved, even warlocks. People tend to use more flame-based abilities. I wanted to say magic, but it really depends on their campaign, if you call it magic or not. They're unfortunately one of the weakest, even though they're the more interesting one, in my opinion, of the chromatic dragons, to which, because they're the weakest, people usually have them being more of a roleplay aspect rather than an actual combat villainous dragon. In fact, to my dismay, in my previous large homebrew campaign, they did meet a white dragon, and without even trying to see to reason why this dragon was freaking out, they killed it, and it was a young one. So they are the weakest. To which then they went to extreme and even harvested parts off of it before dumping it into the icy water. So that was a whole event. They're not necessarily harmless, they're just weaker in comparison to the other ones when it comes to CR level, and then what's available to them to use. So most of the time you would want to leave them to only roleplay aspects. They do have probably the best intellect of them, especially when it comes to memory. So you could have them, you know, be young first when meeting the party, then when they're older, however the party interacted with them and made an impact will show again later. That's what I was trying to do, however that did not work. If you have a trigger happy party, they will be trigger happy. Especially when they're like, oh, dragon parts are very expensive, we can get a lot of money. Like, okay, you're right, but ow, my character. I guess, supposing of that, some may argue it's because they're more feral, but once you are in the Arctic, where hardly anyone shows up, I'd like to think they would have a bit more curiosity first. That being said, their breath attack, of course, would be ice or frost. The next one you hardly see used, even though it should be a more common one. It's not, in my experience, common. Brown dragons, because a lot of the times people don't go to the desert. Plus, most of the time, their appearance, people would have them as being wingless. But the fact that they are neutral evil instead of straight up chaotic evil gives you a little bit of leeway for roleplay, especially if you have something they may want. You can kind of introduce different roleplay aspects. Their lair actions mostly are weather events, because they burrow in the sand and kind of have a more of a flatland area. And because of this, in combat, they can be pretty tricky for your party members. Not necessarily on the power arc, but because they can burrow in sand and they don't have wings, your party members may not have too much of an option for combat. And I don't really like leaving my parties to figure it out only, and me just sit there like an evil villain laughing I like to give them a bit more of a reasonable way to do things. They're kind of a more simple one to explain, because it really is based on how much you are okay about letting your party members fend for themselves or not. Purple dragons. I hardly see them used at all, even though purple is a very amazing color. And a lot of times the reason why they're hardly used is because they're mainly present in the Underdark. To which most of the time you would only ever go to the Underdark unless you have a campaign that is mainly set in the Underdark. And even then, only in recent times, the only reason why people know about the Underdark is because of Baldur's Gate. Because it's the same thing with the Underdark. People hardly interact with drows because they are also mainly part of the Underdark, and things like mind flayers and cloakers and other little oddball things that you would find there. To which those can be some of the more interesting creatures and villain characters to have. So especially if you haven't played Baldur's Gate 3 yet, definitely recommend it. Their version of the Underdark is very beautiful. Beautiful in the sense that they have a lot of good world building for it. I was exploring there quite a lot. These ones are also more slender and agile, and they will mostly stalk the party before they interact. To which a lot of the creatures in the Underdark will likely do the same thing. They may even act like they're a pile of rocks, different creatures, before they surprise attack your party members. They also have a more chaotic evil nature, and very much on that part because of the different psychic abilities and layer actions that they have available to terrorize your party. Especially because their breath weapon does psychic damage. It's one of those things that if you have a lot of casters in your party, that can really hurt. Because casters are very squishy, and if it's a non-physical effect, it can start to get very hairy very quick. Okay, even though I used grey for white, we're going back to grey for grey dragon. I believe that's a viewable. They have different names. A lot of people use stuff like Fang Dragon. They may act like people are mistaking them for white dragons for roleplay and storytelling aspect. Because even though they're similar in what they look like, grey dragons have an acid breath instead of ice breath. But they're also less for flying and more for fighting. A lot of the things with them is that they're very violent compared to the very weak white dragon. So in a roleplay aspect for your party, if they think something is a white dragon, they're like, oh, it's so weak. We don't have to worry about it. Surprise, it's actually a grey dragon, and they get to have fun with that. It is a very, oh, look at that. Unfortunate. You're going to have to suffer. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, hold on. Bam, bam, bam. I don't like that color. Yellow dragons is one. I do see them up in campaigns quite often. even though different books will say that they're very few. Whenever something is very few when it comes to rule books, people would like to play with them to have an interesting factor to their game. However, you could still do the same without having party members ever interact with one. Different rule books will state the fact, yeah, they hardly show up in history, but that's the history of the rule books. If you're doing something homebrew or like the books but only using it as a guideline, you can have them however often you wish. But a lot of it is because they're solitary, secretive most of the time. A lot of times people confuse them for gold dragons. Very different. They also are more of a desert creature as well. They're very few, but at the same time, despite the rulebook stating they're rare, you can have them show up in different things that players actually will interact with. So things like carvings in a wall, different depictions in books. You can add an air of anxiety and worry for the party without ever having them interact with one. Perhaps it was an old abandoned lair of a yellow dragon. Because I believe a lot of the dragon horde items can last for quite a while. So if you have a good reason that the dragon is no longer present in their lair without being dead, I believe some of them will still have some of the soaked in magic, to which there's different levels of how potent a magical item is when it's been in a horde. Some people may also call these salt dragons at times because of the desert function. So living in salt flats, marshes, but because it's different, both of them technically, air quotes, are very rare. You can kind of mix up what you want to do with them, especially with the homebrew. There can always be reasons why a dragon is not in the habitat that a game mode will say it will be in. Perhaps that's even the reason why this dragon is irritated, considering most of the chromatic dragons are a version of evil, especially if you look towards different storytelling aspects, like when Critical Role did Vox Machina. The different dragons there, they had reason for why they weren't really in their areas. And they had a lot of dragons in specific places at once interacting. So if you think you can make it work, go on and do it. Have fun with it. And if you haven't watched Vox Machina, you should. Season 2 is already announced. They already announced that they're doing it for the Mighty Nine. So that will be fun. Everyone changes color, but there is also pink dragons. Pink dragons often get shafted, in fact, for metallic, gem, and planar dragons, because these ones are supposed to be more of a funny aspect and tricky, but you have a lot of planar dragons, like the opalescent dragon, that can fill that role too, the dream dragon, because they have been in the Fey realm. They mostly take up that area of being the tricky, playful dragon that a party will interact with. I believe we're making good time. Also for the chromatic dragons, for all of them, they are very... You can have them as creatures, you can have them as NPCs, you can have them have their own means of what they do and why they do it. However, overall, they do fall under Tiamat. Tiamat is more like their patron. So if you have dragonborn characters, you can also play into the whole, oh, perhaps they have a chromatic dragon as family, perhaps they have chromatic dragon as a patron, all the way up to Tiamat. Tiamat herself hardly will get used unless you are doing a campaign that involves Tiamat or different underlings to Tiamat, or even, oh, there's a lot you can do. I even went to a local store where they had a quote-unquote miniature, but it's actually a very large figure, like a $400 USD figure that's painted and all. And I had a conversation with one of the workers there, and he was like, honestly, I don't see a reason why a party would ever have to interact with Tiamat or that figure or any of the ones underneath Tiamat. I pretty much said that no, I would have bought that just for me to have on display because it would be hilarious. Tyranny of Dragons, the Dragon Horde, all of those rulebooks have different things you can kind of mess with that for. There's a lot of campaigns you can do where Tiamat is trying to escape, or where different figures underneath Tiamat are very evil and trying to do her deeds, or you don't even have to have Tiamat involved. Alright, we will be moving to metallic dragons. I will be a bit funny with this. Hold on. You're gonna see how I do some things. It. Bam, 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 bam. The favorite campaign I've done. Oh, it definitely was my homebrew one. Maybe because I really do love dragons when it comes to different fantasy aspects, world building, especially when it came to things like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I was very distraught with Smaug. I wanted him to last for a long time, but he very much didn't. He was pretty weak. So my homebrew had an overarching story when it came to having dragons involved. However, the party never really interacted with them at all. There was a lot of opportunities for them to, but it was mainly going to show in season 2 of the campaign, to which this campaign, season 1, did last over a year and a little more of a half a year after that. So it's a very long-term story. They were a level 12 at the beginning of season 2, just around that. And the dragons in there were starting to have this sort of madness, sickness going on. So the patron deities for them, like Tiamat, Bahamut, and all of those, they weren't even involved or hardly existed. So dragons with that were going insane. The party had a lot of opportunity to try to figure that out. Most of the time it wasn't because that they didn't want to, is they didn't have the opportunity to because they were focusing on different paths. And the reason why that's my favorite campaign, besides the dragon aspect of it, is I was teaching a couple of them how to play for the first time. So that's always rewarding for my party to learn how to play for the first time, getting to experiment with all the freedom that they have in D&D. And then seeing my party develop their own storylines as well and things they want to do. That's pretty much why I usually do homebrew, instead of using things by different rule books, like when they give adventure settings and this and that, despite that being easier than homebrew. I like giving them a lot more wiggle room to decide if they want to do character growth or just a story. Most of the time, I've only had people want to do character growth. They like to interact with NPCs, to which I love making NPCs. I'll have many, or if I have to make something up on the spot, I will. Like mentioning last session with talking with Opal, there was a brief mention where she mind-slivered an NPC because her character got upset. It was an NPC I didn't want them to have to interact with, but then they were asking this guy more and more questions like, oh, what's your name? So I had to very much make up things on the spot, and then she mind-slivered him over the cost of a ferry ride to the next island. So having the freedom to do different things for campaigns is what makes it very rewarding for me. Besides that one, I did play as a player in a Curse of Strahd campaign. To which, if you're a newer player, Curse of Strahd is one of the more harder ones to get adjusted to, get used to. Its difficulty scaling is a bit higher than most things. I like being a player in games. I don't mind being a DM either. But as a player, I will be a thorn in my DM's side. Not in the annoying sense, but because I like making things very 50-50 for me when I'm a player. So there were a lot of times my character was weak to what was happening. And then as a Twilight Cleric, which can be a very paladin character, because they do have the proficiency to use plate armor and to use mace weapons and this and that, I didn't do that. Instead, I gave the weakest stats what should have been the highest. I pretty much flipped things to make them more of a caster. And I did add interesting aspects to it. I also had to roll on the madness table because I tried to do a lot of different mental games with a bunch of NPCs, and I got my butt kicked for that, which I happily accepted. My poor lesser played party members, they would panic. I knew what I was doing in a sense that I knew if I was messing around, I would get punished. And in Curse of Strahd, there is a reason why I nearly got one-shot auto KO'd. I was 1 health point away from it being an automatic death. So that was also very fun, because it was a very risky campaign, and I like risk. Especially if you play something like Baldur's Gate, people who've never played D&D before are getting introduced to a tabletop turn-based format. So they're understanding a bit. Some of my old co-workers who haven't gotten into D&D, they're even starting to get into D&D, and so it's always an interesting thing to be like, what have you enjoyed? And for me, it's, yeah, the homebrew is my favorite because of the whole people learning, people figuring out what they can do, being creative. Seeing that the very sandbox attitude of D&D, even if it's from a rulebook, you can give them a lot of freedom. And sometimes that freedom is them asking me if they could put their hand in a villain's mouth. And I'm like, all right, let's do a roll to see if you can bring your hand out before it gets chomped off. Any awkward pauses I take, I am drinking my drink. Do you have a favorite you've done or been a part of? Because definitely for me, it's things where players can be a bit more involved in what they're doing. Giving them that freedom to make choices especially when it comes to their characters, is very nice. It is the very much fuck around, find out mindset. Alright, I'll quickly go through the metallic ones before I have to end stream, since I do have errands to run today, and then things like the planar dragons, gem dragons, we'll get through on another thing. Tomorrow we will be going over villains in D&D, to which that'll be a little bit different than this because there's not very much segments to go through and like run down on each type and this and that. I'll be giving a lot of suggestions on how you can use them in your games without them being boring. Some people will argue that villains have to be this way or that way, but villains can also be some of the more interesting characters in my opinion. And I will literally go on a rant about it tomorrow. Especially when it came to the dragons, they can also be very interesting. No. Metallic dragons. Metallic dragons are one of the ones that people use as patrons for their characters more than any other dragon. They are the more religious sort of dragons when it comes to D&D, especially in the rule books. They will say this, especially because Bahamut is their patron deity for the most part, like Tiamat was for the chromatic ones. They can be very hit or miss if you want them to be aggressive or not. There are also ones that people will use to be a very goal thing for the characters. Like, oh, if they want to go treasure hunting, if they want to interact with dragons, kill them and you take their scales, it will most likely be a metallic dragon, much to some DM's dismay. It's only because when party members see something shiny, they have the mindset of, oh, is this worth it if I take this and try to sell it? Very cool. And the first one is a gold dragon. They are the more powerful. They're the more ones you will see often in campaigns. Gold dragons are the more coveted ones to have in the storytelling. To which it's like, how should I say this? When people are trying to describe the dragons and everything, they will most likely have a gold dragon because a lot of times they want something to be a sort of treasure hunting guarantee for the party members. If they want to spoil them, they will most likely have a gold dragon involved. Especially if you prefer to have simple layers or dungeons. These are usually found in stony areas, so you can have them in caves and caverns and such. That in keeping the simplicity of having a fire breath weapon. To which, and then you also have the very fun part of playing with the morals, or morals. I can't. If you noticed from previous videos, I do have trouble pronouncing some things. But a lot of these are lawful good. So when you have characters that are coveting these golden scales and wanting to kill them for selling them to different cities and this and thus, they will have to deal with the problematic aspects of destroying or tricking a character that's lawful good with good memory. With my party member, when they did have an interaction with a gold dragon, it was a young one who had a little goblin paladin as their sort of guard in a way that protected them. because I also thought having a goblin paladin was amazing. They did trick and lie to the gold dragon. However, they will never see the outcome of that because it would take a bit of time for it to grow. But we also did end that campaign. It's also when you're getting near their layers, a lot of the layer actions for metallic dragons start getting to the very much dangerous scale. Like having with purple dragons and green dragons, where they can kind of have that very passive layer action and environment action. You can really play around with it. Silver dragons now, they're the more regal ones. You'll often see them in artwork in campaigns. So you may have them as embroidery on clothes, you may have them as artwork or in scrolls and poetry. It's not a factor of rarity or not, but they're just more elegant in nature. And even you would see them be as humanoid figures in campaigns. Especially because elven culture, they would even interact with the elves, they would interact with humans, because with the humanoid sort of thing and the fact that they can use various magic, being curious and regal that they are, they may take up different positions of power or even be just a rich character in a city. Especially because if you have a city that's very rocky or in the mountains, you'll most likely find that a good place for them. But because their breath weapon is ice, you can sort of play it around like, oh, if your party member goes into this beautiful mansion to ask for this merchant's aid in whatever nonsense they have going on, perhaps that mansion is very cold when they go in. You can have little hints and aspects to something is very wrong. Otherwise, most of the time, they may just assume the character is a lich or something, because if it's cold, that automatically means death. And that does happen a lot. Different campaigns I've either been a DM for or been a party member for, most of the time they will think suddenly cold surroundings is something deathly or very bad. In some cases that can be true though. Let's see. Next one. Bronze dragon. I think bronze dragons are fun. They also have electrical breath. So a lot of times I like to imagine them in more steampunk surrounded campaigns. They're also another lawful good and some chaotic good, but you can have a sort of wiggle room with them having more on the coast areas that they'd like to be. You can even have them be humanoids within a merchant fish town. Have them be a part of different pirate-based things. There's a lot of wiggle room and creative ideas that you can use when it comes to a bronze dragon. Bronze dragons as well are one of the ones that you would have interacting with a party more often than not with the other ones. Other ones you may only find in poetry and all these different neutral aspects. But silver and bronze dragons do have the potential to interact with your party, even if your party does not know it. Plus also if they are part of like a more naval and pirate sort of surrounding thing, they do like warfare and tactic. So perhaps they are a captain or plays the part of an officer or just someone with a lot of money that likes to entertain themselves with whatever goes on with the humanoid figures in the surrounding areas. Does this look copper? I'm gonna say that's copper. Copper dragons start getting into the more things like with planar and gem dragons, where they start to be more of a pain in the butt for the party members, since they are starting to get into aspect of being characters that would prank your party and mess around with them. Plus the fact that they are chaotic good. So while they are good, they, intention-wise, will be good. Practice-wise, they will mess around till they get to that point. You can have them be very Cheshire Cat sort of characters, especially when it comes to riddles and playing pranks. They don't really like combat, despite their breath weapon being acid. So they do have a power capability, but they don't really usually care for combat. So instead they'll do different layer actions and things to have mental games going on with the party. In case and everything, you can always have them be a very chaotic neutral character if you must be. Ones that can mess with the party and not necessarily get them to where they wish to be. Maybe they reveal information for the party without the party ever really meeting them face to face, talking and jokes and riddles and information. And then brass dragons will probably be one of the ones you see the most interact with party members besides silver. Silver, they like to be discreet in how they do it, but brass dragons, they love to talk. The only things that is really sad is that they're usually in desert climates. Not necessarily places as just the desert, but you can have them in different desert sort of cities, in merchant towns, traveling roads. They also will have more avoided combat moments, especially because their breath weapon puts you to sleep. So one, them not wanting to get into combat, and two, I doubt the party would want to get into combat with one. But just like the white dragons, they are considered the more weak ones of their groups. So even though that they are weak, they try to avoid combat anyways. These ones have a little bit more wiggle room for being able to hold themselves to combat rather than white dragons with their lesser way. Because at least this, they can put you to sleep and then run off. The other ones I won't color in here and just briefly go over, because while they are in different books and online for homebrews, you hardly see them in the games. That being Mercury dragons, Iron dragons, and Steel dragons. Those three, while they sort of exist, they start to get into things that are official, like planar and gem dragons. So instead of having these three, you can just go for planar or gem dragons and have a little bit more to work with. Unless you like the idea of having Mercury dragons that are more mentally unstable ones, especially if you have a dragon sickness going on. They're the more whimsical sort of messed up ones. You can even have them being jokers sort of characters. Iron and Steel, they are more predatorial, social. You can actually have them interact with the party, though they start to get into the aspect of good and evil with those two. a lot of times you can have them in more industrial sort of settings for your D&D campaign. But most of the time when people play D&D specifically, they want it to be more fantasy related. If you went for a different tabletop RPG system, like vampire or alien, then you start to get into different things that are more modern. Especially with alien, obviously that's going to be more futuristic. Especially if you wanted a tabletop RPG that's very difficult, then definitely alien. But this is just D&D stuff. The other one I also won't color in is the Platinum Dragon because they're very few and rare. Much like gold, you would only really see them in different neutral aspects of the gameplay, be it art, poetry, song. Platinum Dragons are like that because Bahamut and everything like that are more of a fairy tale for your party members. Especially because they can only really considered by the rulebook only one Platinum Dragon existed, and that being Bahamut. Which is funny because when it comes to things like Final Fantasy and everything, it was gold. Or red. Really depends on which version you're looking at. Especially because if you look at something now changed like Final Fantasy XIV, Bahamut kind of goes to different stages of alterations throughout the story for various reasons. Early games with pixel art and going into later games changes up a lot. So even in fantasy settings to D&D settings to different storytelling, well, it varies between crimson, gold, and platinum. That, and also because platinum is considered the more strong ones of the metallic dragons, and arguably even all of the different segment of dragons. But if you only consider that the powerhouse, you can't get into the various different aspects of gem dragons, planar dragons, to which those, yeah, because I've run out of time a bit here, we'll be going over at a later time. Maybe I'll actually do some pre-made art instead of just changing this picture. With those different ones though, they have a lot more storytelling things you can do with them. It's likely due to the fact that those are more recent rulebooks, especially for the Tyranny of Dragons and Fizban Treasury of Dragons. Fizban's, though, is very good because gem dragons are very interesting. Different aspects of those you can really get into the whole storytelling aspect. So if you're starting to DM for a campaign, or if you're playing in one, you could always ask about what is involved dragon-wise. Of course, unfortunately, in most campaigns, you won't interact with dragons much. However, I think there is a lot of wiggle room for possibility. It's very unfortunate that most of the time people associate dragons with being villain characters, despite most of the time they are neutral or good. But a lot of that is because chromatic dragons were the very base form of dragon NPCs, and since most of them are viewed as evil, yeah, they basically get treated as villains in campaigns. And that's not incorrect to do. People can do as they wish, but I feel like dragons in D&D really just have more wiggle room to do a lot more. And I think that will be it for today. I plan to eventually do a campaign of just like dragon lore one day. One day I will get my way. Or at least have them more involved. Unfortunately, it's just like, while you can do it, you really won't have people doing it too often. Or even if you have a party involved, yeah, they may just view them as villains for the most part. Alright. Tomorrow we will be doing villains in D&D. Villains, one of my favorite things to have, despite my rant that not all dragons will be villains. Villains are a great story point for your campaigns because they do not have to be just evil to be evil. They can be multifaceted, but they also can be evil just to be evil. Especially because if you have a little bit more wiggle room for your villains in D&D, it also explains villains in different settings. Especially if you played the Final Fantasy games, any of them, a lot of the early ones especially. And like 1 through 8 were very good with portraying villains, especially with their looks. And then Final Fantasy 14 really just kind of brings a lot of them back and amplifies them, especially having them all involved in the same sort of setting. So a lot of the times villains in gameplay, in storytelling, and even in cinema, there's a lot of wiggle room you can do with villains, but I won't do a whole rant about villains in any storytelling aspect. I'll just do it for D&D for tomorrow. And it will be, I believe I have it set to be a little bit of a later stream, but let me double check. Because despite having made my own schedule, who knows what I put. Let's see here. Yes. No. It will be same time tomorrow. It's Saturday, where I'm a little bit later in the day with Baldur's Gate. Tomorrow we'll be at the same time talking about the villains in D&D. Pre-made ones and custom ones. So, that'll be another stream. Have a wonderful rest of your day or a good night or whichever time zone it is for you. We will pick this up again with the rest of the dragons at a later date. Maybe next week, maybe take some more time in between. Have a good one.